Okay, then. It's a very good morning and assalamu alaikum to all of you. We're here to do embryology with you, first of all. Ji beta, so you have a question. Walaikum assalam. Thank you, मेरा बेटा. अच्छा मुझे ये बताइए, do you have any questions regarding your first substage in head and neck? Anything you did not understand? Any questions, any queries? कोई बात जो आपने मेरे से पूछनी हो? क्योंकि एक बात तो मुझे पता है बेटा कि SEQs में तो 100% आप लोगों ने कॉपी पेस्ट किया हुआ है. I know that. ठीक है. बाकी बात कर ले. That is, if you have any questions. Otherwise, हम embryology शुरू करके we'll finish up with embryology in say 10-15 minutes and devote topic in gross anatomy. उस दिन हम dural venous sinuses कर रहे थे and I had to stop in the middle of nowhere क्योंकि time खत्म हो गया था, but I had this in mind कि I will have more time after this lecture क्योंकि this is a very short lecture. अच्छा जी, since there is no question, let's start off with the cranial anomalies of the cranium, anomalies of the skull. एक इसमें है anomaly which is called cranioschisis. That means the skull has not developed. Calvaria is absent, that is, skull cap is absent. This is also accompanied by, यहाँ पे आप देख लीजिए कि the brain is lying outside and the skull cap, इसको यहाँ ऐसे complete होना चाहिए था. The skull cap is missing. This is always accompanied by defects in vertebral column because skull and vertebral column, they develop hand in hand. इसकी वजह ये भी है कि brain and spinal cord, they are all parts of the central nervous system. अब ये why doesn't the skull develop? उस दिन भी आपको बताया था कि the skull develops around the developing brain. Mesenchyme around the developing brain develops into skull, and it is the brain that gives out inductive influence, induces the overlying mesenchyme overlying the brain. The brain induces the mesenchyme to develop into the skull. When the brain doesn't develop, so the skull fails to develop. Okay? Acha. So, in conditions called meroencephaly or anencephaly, this anencephaly का मतलब तो है complete absence of brain. वो होता नहीं है because part of the brain always is developed. A small part of the brain develops. Meroencephaly means partial development of the brain. ठीक है, so partial development of the brain होती है उसकी वजह से कि ये side of the skull do develop, but the top of the skull, the calvaria, does not develop. This occurs in 1 in 1,000 live births. और अब cause क्या है? Why doesn't the brain develop? Brain does not develop because brain develops from cranial end of neural tube. So if the cranial end of neural tube, if that fails to fuse, अगर ये neural tube close नहीं करेगी by the 4th week, तो फिर brain develop नहीं होगा. So the cranial most part of the neural tube that fails to close or fails to fuse, whatever you want to call it, and that results in failure of the brain to develop. जब brain नहीं होगा तो उसे calvaria develop नहीं होगा because the brain induces the overlying mesenchyme to develop into calvaria. अच्छा, अब ये एक और है, इसको craniosynostosis कहते हैं. Craniosynostosis means there is closure of sutures of the skull. आपको मैंने उस दिन बताया था कि the sutures of the skull do not fuse. Adult life में जाके, in fact old age में जाके fusion start होती है. Otherwise the brain, the sutures do not close. But if they close in prenatal life before birth, तो multiple problems arise because of that. अब क्यों होता है कि early closure of sutures हो जाए? The cause is unknown. Still don't know why the sutures close early. Maybe a question mark है कि pregnancy में if the doctor gives anticonvulsant drugs, supposing there is a patient who is suffering from epilepsy, तो उसको तो दवाइयाँ देनी है, but then certain medicines given during epilepsy can cause this craniosynostosis. अब ये जो abnormality है craniosynostosis की, this is more in males compared to females. So males में ज़्यादा होता है, females में कम होता है. And as you can imagine, this is also associated with abnormalities of the skeletal system. अब deformities different types की होती हैं, and the deformities depend on what suture closes early. अभी इसको discuss करते हैं one by one. ये देख लीजिए, this is long wedge shaped skull. ये देख लीजिए, long wedge shaped skull. This develops because there is early closure of sagittal suture. Sagittal suture is the suture between the two parietal bones. Okay? So the suture between the two parietal bones, that is the sagittal suture, if that closes early, the cranium or the skull is long, wedge shaped. And about half the cases of craniosynostosis, they are because of early closure of sagittal suture. इसको स्केफोसेफली कहते हैं. ठीक है, अच्छा जी. Now this is another type of deformity. अब इसमें देखिए, the skull is high, tower-like. ठीक है, this occurs because of early closure of coronal suture. Coronal suture, this is the coronal suture, crown-like. This is a suture between the parietal bones and the frontal bone. ये frontal bone इधर, यहाँ parietal bones, the suture between them. 30% cases में ये deformity होती है, high tower like skull कहते हैं, इसको brachycephaly भी कहते हैं. ये देख लीजिए, plagiocephaly. अब इसमें this side is normal, this side is affected. This is because the coronal suture, premature coronal suture की closure on one side only. This is the affected side. So the skull is kind of twisted. Asymmetrical skull होती है. Only one side of the coronal suture is affected. The other side is normal. ये देख लीजिए, trigonocephaly. ये frontal bossing जो है, prominence है frontal bone की. This is because of premature closure of this frontal suture. Frontal bone also develops as two bones, and between these two bones you have frontal suture. So if the frontal suture closes prematurely, तो prominent midline ये deformity आपको नजर आ जाएगी. ठीक है? This is microcephaly, a small skull. To begin with, the skull appears normal, but then as the child grows, the skull does not grow. The skull does not grow because the brain does not grow normally. Okay? So, because of abnormal development of the brain, the skull does not grow normally. Because I told you from the very beginning that development of the skull is dependent on the development of the brain. The brain does not develop, the overlying mesenchyme, it should induce, it does not induce the overlying mesenchyme to develop into skull normally. अच्छा जी, sorry. In these cases, severe mental retardation is present because the brain does not grow normally. So, अगर brain नहीं develop होगा तो mental retardation होगी, and brain नहीं develop होगा तो overlying mesenchyme will not develop into skull. ठीक है? अब अगर आप देख लीजिए कि ये वो कंडीशन है जिसको यहाँ पे हम commonly दौले शाह की चूर कहते हैं, माइक्रोसेफेलिक्स. आपने फकीर देखे होंगे सड़कों पे मांगते हुए. बेटा दिस इज द कंडीशन. ठीक है, इसको माइक्रोसेफेली कहते हैं. तो मिथ तो यही है कि इन बच्चों को वहाँ बाजार पे ले जाते हैं, वहाँ इनके सरों पे टोपियां पहना देते हैं लोहे की, सो दैट ये डेवलप नहीं करती स्काल इनकी. एंड दिस इज द काइंड ऑफ स्टैम्प होती है कि जी इस पीर के बाजार से ये बच्चे आते हैं. अब मुझे नहीं पता क्या होता है, बट इन द पास्ट तो जो मैंने पढ़ा है वो यही है कि दिस फेलो डॉले शाह, ही वाज द सेम होली मैन. तो लोग ये जो माइक्रोसेफेलिक बच्चे थे इनको अबैंडन करके चले जाते थे, छोड़ के फेंक के चले जाते थे, बिकॉज दे वर मेंटली रिटार्डेड. तो ये साहब दौले शाह इन बच्चों को अपने घर पे या अपने आस्थाने पे या दरगाह पे व्हाटएवर वहां पे ले जाते थे, and used to look after these children. So then people started coming to him with these children. They used to leave their children with this man because they knew that the children would be taken care of. So basically defect in बच्चों का था, उन साहब का नहीं था जो सरों पे टोपियां बना देते हैं. अब क्या होता है मैं नहीं जानती, but in the past जो मैंने पढ़ा है वो यही था. So this was just for the sake of interest. Okay, we have a condition called microcephaly in which the skull does not grow because the brain fails to grow. So this is as far as the development of the skull is concerned. I will not be giving you this topic in the test. Test में वही है जिसमें development of cardiovascular system है, development of body cavities हैं, and urinary system and genital system, male and female genital system, urogenital, cardiovascular and body cavities की development. ये skull की development उसमें included नहीं है. Next week inshallah we will do the development of respiratory system inshallah. Any questions? अभी तक जो भी हुआ, any questions regarding that? नहीं है. Fine. So अब इस हम complete करते हैं अपनी gross anatomy का lecture. Let me close this. So we were doing the dural venous sinuses, और उन dural venous sinuses में हमने we did as far as the occipital sinus, and this we now do the most important sinus out of the all the dural venous sinuses. ठीक है, सबसे important from your examination point of view, from practical point of view, this is the most important sinus. एग्जाम में बहुत आता है, वाइवे में बहुत पूछा जाता है, और कुछ हो ना हो आपको cavernous sinus जरूर आना चाहिए. So the cavernous sinus is the largest of the sinuses that we've done so far. ठीक है, अब आपको पता है कि sella turcica, a Turkish saddle, pituitary fossa बेटा आपको बताया था, in which you have the pituitary gland, और मैंने आपको ये भी बताया था कि the pituitary fossa lodges the pituitary gland. ठीक है, ये है pituitary fossa, इसके अंदर pituitary gland होता है. इसकी शेप जो होती है pituitary fossa की, it is like a Turkish saddle. That is why we call it sella turcica. So अब ये sella turcica जो है, this is in the sphenoid bone. ये सारी यहाँ पे sphenoid bone पड़ी हुई है, आपको बताया था. This is the lesser wing of sphenoid, and in the midline is the body of the sphenoid. So body of the sphenoid के अंदर sphenoidal sinus पड़ा हुआ है. So the pituitary gland which is lying in the sella turcica, this pituitary gland is actually lying on top of the sphenoidal sinus. Okay, so अब क्या होता है कि ये जो cavernous sinus है, it is lying on either side of body of sphenoid. ये देखिए, this is one cavernous sinus, this is the other cavernous sinus. ठीक है, यहाँ पे देख लीजिए, a closer look, this is the cavernous sinus. ये anteriorly over here, ये lesser wing of sphenoid है, and deep to this lesser wing of sphenoid, यहाँ पे ये lesser wing of sphenoid है, and deep to this lesser wing of sphenoid, we have the superior orbital fissure. Okay, so the cavernous sinus lies on either side. दो हैं, one on either side, right and left. The cavernous sinus lies on either side of the body of sphenoid. ठीक है, अच्छा जी, extend कहाँ से कहाँ तक करता है? Anteriorly, it extends from the superior orbital fissure, यहाँ पे. मैंने आपको बताया this is the lesser wing of sphenoid. You can see this part. ये suture है, ठीक है? The lesser wing of sphenoid. So anteriorly lesser wing of sphenoid यहाँ पे, and posteriorly of this bone we discussed the other day. This is the petrous part of the temporal bone. Apex of the petrous part of the temporal bone ये है, ठीक है? So this sinus extends anteriorly superior orbital fissure, posteriorly apex of the petrous part of the temporal bone. अब every sinus contains blood. Okay? और ये जो sinus है, cavernous, इसका नाम ही इसलिए है because it is made up of multiple veins, very thin walls, intercommunicating veins. That is why it is called cavernous. Cavernous sinus. Multiple thin walled intercommunicating veins है ये. ठीक है जी? So अब इसमें blood आता कहाँ से है? From the orbit, superior ophthalmic vein, inferior ophthalmic vein. ये देखें, they are coming and draining into the cavernous sinus. अच्छा. And then it also comes from the brain, superficial middle cerebral vein plus sphenoparietal sinus. बेटा ये जो है ये देख लीजिए, lesser wing of sphenoid के ऊपर ये, इनफैक्ट ऊपर नहीं है, it is in at the margin of the lesser wing of sphenoid. ये जो blue color का sinus है, this is called sphenoparietal sinus. ये भी and this side. यहाँ पे देख लीजिए, this is the sphenoparietal sinus. ये. So sphenoparietal sinus drain कर रहे हैं इसमें, superior ophthalmic vein drain कर रही है, inferior ophthalmic vein drain कर रही है, plus a vein of the brain, superficial middle cerebral vein. ठीक है? All these are draining into the cavernous sinus. So incoming blood जो है वो इन चार sources से आता है. Now the sinuses on the right, ये देख लीजिए, this is the pituitary gland. इस pituitary gland में से ये जो नजर आ रहा है, this is center में, this is the stalk of the pituitary gland. So the two यहाँ पे ये देख लीजिए, ये pituitary gland है और ये center में जो है ये stalk of the pituitary gland है. So the two sinuses, right and left, they are connected to each other. In front of the sinus, anterior to the stalk of the pituitary gland, they are connected to each other posterior to the stalk of the pituitary gland. They are also connected to each other deep to the periphery pituitary gland. ये जो connections हैं between the right and left sinus, they are called intercavernous sinus. They are connected to each other anterior and posterior to the stalk of the pituitary gland. So ये अब आपस में भी connected है, उसके अलावा और किससे connected है? ये जो pituitary gland है बेटा, this is also connected to this. ये जो clivus के ऊपर ये sloping surface जो है ना, this is the clivus. ये so इसके ऊपर ये veins पड़ी हुई हैं जिनको basal plexus of veins कहते हैं. So the cavernous sinus is connected. ये देख लीजिए, ये cavernous sinus है and it is connected to the basal plexus of veins. Cavernous sinus connected to the basal plexus of veins. Besides, आपको ये भी पता है कि we've discussed this earlier on that the pterygoid venous plexus हमने किया था, पिछली substage में भी था, that is connected also to the cavernous sinus. So इसकी अब जो connections हैं उसमें basal plexus of veins and pterygoid venous plexus. जी, तो अब हमने इनकमिंग सोर्सेस कर ली, आउटगोइंग ड्रेन कहाँ करना है? Blood has to go somewhere. So where does it go? Sorry. ब्लड गोज, ये देख लीजिए, ये आपको जाता हुआ नजर आ रहा है। ये cavernous sinus है बेटा, and it is draining into this vein. This drain lying on the apex of the petrous temporal bone, इसको हम superior petrosal sinus कहते हैं। ये ठीक है, this one is the superior petrosal sinus. It is starting from the posterior end of the cavernous sinus. ये देख लीजिए, ये ठीक है, starting from the posterior end of the cavernous sinus, you have this dural venous sinus, which is lying on the apex of the petrous temporal bone. उसके अलावा you also have another sinus, inferior petrosal sinus. मैं आपको दिखा देती हूँ, ये this is the inferior petrosal sinus. ये भी cavernous sinus के posterior end से शुरू होता है। ये देख लीजिए इस तस्वीर में, this is the inferior petrosal sinus, ठीक है, this is the superior petrosal sinus, this is the inferior petrosal sinus. They both start from the posterior end of the cavernous sinus. आगे चलते हैं, contents of the cavernous sinus, बहुत important question है बेटा, ये आपके बारे में भी आता है, MCQ, SCQ। अब contents में बेटा हम दो तरह से डिस्कस करते हैं। They are structures that are lying inside the sinus, within the sinus, and then there are structures that are lying in the wall of the sinus. ठीक है, so when you talk of the contents, तो फिर आपको दोनों किस्म के लिखने हैं, बताने होंगे। अब what are the contents lying within the substance of the sinus? Lying within the substance of the sinus is internal carotid artery, and this is the sixth cranial nerve, which is the abducent nerve. And this internal carotid artery is also surrounded by a sympathetic plexus of nerves. ये देख लीजिए, ये cavernous sinus है। Inside the cavernous, ये देख लीजिए, ये thread-like connections इसके दरमियान में, ठीक है। Inside the cavernous sinus, this is the internal carotid artery, and this is accompanied by sixth cranial nerve or the abducent nerve. और इसके ऊपर अगर आप देखिए, इसकी wall के ऊपर you can see this plexus of nerves. Wall of the internal carotid artery is, you have sympathetic nerve plexus. Now in the lateral wall, structures lying in the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus from superior to inferior, इसलिए क्योंकि ये horizontally placed नहीं है, ये थोड़ा सा anteroposteriorly slope होता है इसके। So wall में देख लीजिए, sorry, this is the third cranial nerve, oculomotor. ये जो है, this is the third cranial nerve, oculomotor. Next we have this very thin nerve, fourth cranial nerve, which is trochlear, and then comes this very thick cranial nerve, the thickest of all, trigeminal. You can see the three branches. Ophthalmic, this is the ophthalmic, going into the superior orbital fissure. Then you have, this is the maxillary, going into the foramen rotundum. You can see it going into the foramen rotundum, and you have this mandibular going into the foramen ovale. But remember one thing, please remember one thing, lying in the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus. अब इसमें से lateral wall में से dura has been removed, so you cannot exactly see the lateral wall. You can just see the contents of the lateral wall. Only two divisions of the trigeminal nerve are present in the lateral wall. You can see over here, you have the ophthalmic division and you have the maxillary division. ये mandibular division is outside the lateral wall. अब मैं आपको दोबारा सब स्ट्रक्चर्स दिखा देती हूँ. This is the third cranial nerve, oculomotor. This is the trochlear nerve. Trochlear is the fourth cranial nerve, and then comes your fifth cranial nerve. जिसकी दो divisions हैं यहाँ पे, ophthalmic and maxillary. अगर एक cut section दिखाएं, this is a very commonly asked question. Draw and label diagram, a cut section of the cavernous sinus. So this is the pituitary gland. This is the cavernous sinus. Thin-walled veins, multiple thin-walled intercommunicating veins, structures lying within the substance of the sinus, internal carotid artery, surrounded by the plexus of nerves, and lying infralateral. ये देख लीजिए, sixth cranial nerve, which is abducent nerve. ठीक है? Substances within, structures within the substance. I repeat once again, inside the cavernous sinus. Internal carotid artery, surrounded by its nerve plexus, and then you also have the sixth cranial nerve. ये अब ये देख लीजिए lateral wall में. From superior to inferior, you have the third cranial nerve, oculomotor, fourth cranial nerve, trochlear, fifth cranial nerve की ophthalmic division, fifth cranial nerve की maxillary division. ये ठीक है? Okay. Any questions? Any questions as far as cavernous sinus is concerned? I guess not. अच्छा जी, superior petrosal sinus की बात कर देते हैं. So now we are talking about this cavern venous sinus, ये वाला, which is lying on the apex of the petrous temporal bone. ठीक है? आपको पहले भी बताया था, it starts at the posterior end of the petrous temporal cavernous sinus. जहाँ पे मेरा कर्सर है इस वक्त, cavernous sinus के posterior end. ठीक है? It starts from there and now it is running posteriorly. It is running posteriorly on the apex of the petrous temporal bone. It runs posteriorly and it is entering over here. Now this is the site. ये transverse sinus था, if you remember. This was the transverse sinus. So this inferior petrosal sinus is entering the transverse sinus. So the superior petrosal sinus drains into the transverse sinus. Where in the transverse sinus? This is important because at the point, at the site where the transverse sinus bends inferiorly and continues as the sigmoid sinus. ये sigmoid sinus था. ये transverse sinus था, and I told you, posterior end of the apex of petrous temporal bone, the transverse sinus bends down and continues as the sigmoid sinus. ये sigmoid sinus. So the superior petrosal sinus enters the transverse sinus at this point where the transverse sinus bends down and becomes continuous as the sigmoid sinus. And I told you location uski jo hai, location mein it is lying at the top of apex of petrous temporal bone. अब एक चीज और है, if you remember correctly, apex of the petrous temporal bone, you had the attachment of the tentorium cerebelli. This is the site where you have the attachment of the tentorium cerebelli, apex of the petrous temporal bone. So, tentorium cerebelli was attached at the apex of the petrous temporal bone, and it continued posteriorly on the posterior inner aspect of the occipital bone. वो जो ग्रूव था ट्रांसवर्स साइनस के, उसके मार्जिन्स पे ये टेंटोरियम लगा हुआ था. ठीक है. So tentorium contained two dural venous sinus at its attachment. Superior petrosal sinus and posteriorly, posterolaterally and then posteriorly, tentorium के margins पे लगा हुआ है ट्रांसवर्स साइनस. इसके अटैच्ड एंड में, अटैच्ड मार्जिन में ये you have the superior petrosal sinus and you also have the transverse sinus. और ये मैं आपको दिखा दूं, टेंटोरियम है ये, ठीक है. इसके अटैच्ड मार्जिन में this is the superior petrosal sinus, this is the transverse sinus. Posteriorly, posterolaterally and posteriorly you have the transverse sinus lying in the attached margin of tentorium. ठीक है. और आप ये भी देख लीजिए, ये देख लीजिए transverse sinus lying in the attached margin. और आप ये भी देख लीजिए कि tentorium की ये फ्री मार्जिन है. इस फ्री मार्जिन continued on this side. The free margins, this is the tentorial notch. Is tentorial notch, you see that there is no venous sinus present in the margin of the tentorium. ये tentorium है, इसके margin में, इसके free margin में कोई venous sinus नहीं पड़ा हुआ. ठीक है जी. Attached margin में दो venous sinuses पड़े हुए हैं. Okay. अच्छा जी. So inferior petrosal sinus पे आ जाते हैं. Inferior petrosal sinus. अब बेटा ये देखो, ये petrous temporal bone है, ये occipital bone है, basilar part of the occipital bone. ये this is the groove. You can see this groove between the petrous temporal bone and occipital bone, basilar part of the occipital bone. ये lying on this groove is the inferior petrosal sinus. इस groove के ऊपर inferior petrosal sinus पड़ा हुआ है. यहाँ पे देख लीजिए, ये this is the inferior petrosal sinus. Please also note that the inferior petrosal sinus starts at the posterior end of the cavernous sinus. ये देख लीजिए. It is starting at the posterior end of the cavernous sinus. And this inferior petrosal sinus is flowing out of this foramen, which is the jugular foramen. ये जो है ना बेटा, this foramen is the jugular foramen, and the inferior petrosal sinus flows out of this jugular foramen. दूसरा मैंने आपको बताया था, ये transverse sinus था, which continues antro-inferiorly as the sigmoid sinus. और मैंने आपको ये भी बताया था कि the sigmoid sinus flows out of the skull through the jugular foramen. ये ठीक है. So sigmoid sinus is flowing out of the skull and continues as the internal jugular vein. So internal jugular vein is simply a continuation of the sigmoid sinus. और ये आपका जो inferior petrosal sinus है, this joins the internal jugular vein. In fact, first tributary of the internal jugular vein जो है वो inferior petrosal sinus ही होती है. Basal plexus of veins. Okay. This sloping surface of the skull is the clivus. Okay? Lying on the clivus is this plexus of veins, which is called basal plexus of veins. This basal plexus of veins connects the two inferior petrosal sinuses. एक ये inferior petrosal sinus है, दूसरा ये inferior petrosal sinus है. Between the two, you have the basal plexus of veins, and inferiorly the basal plexus of veins communicates with the internal vertebral venous plexus. Basal plexus of veins, it is outside the skull. It is communicating with the internal vertebral venous plexus. अब यहाँ पे मैंने आपको उस दिन भी बताया था कि lying on the clivus is the brainstem, and brainstem हमने कहा from superior to inferior it is midbrain, pons and medulla. So brainstem is part of the brain which comprises of midbrain, pons and medulla. और इस particular area clivus के ऊपर you have the pons and medulla lying over here. So the blaze इधर इसके ऊपर. So the basilar plexus of veins is lying deep to the pons and medulla. So obviously it will drain the pons and the medulla. अच्छा, आगे चलते हैं. Any questions so far before I go on to the emissary veins? Peter, do we have any questions? Any questions? I guess not. I don't think, suppose you people are listening. Anyway, that's your problem. Emissary veins को आप कर लेते हैं. Emissary veins बेटा ये skull है. ठीक है, this is the bone of the skull. Skulls के दरमियान sutures हैं. Sutures of the skull. ठीक है, which are filled up with fibrous connective tissue. Now, emissary veins are the veins that connect. This is the dural venous sinus, superior sagittal कह ले. Mainly superior sagittal नहीं होता. So this is the dural venous sinus. This emissary vein connects the dural venous sinus with veins outside the skull. Obviously, they pass through the sutures of the skull, or even bones. They make up openings in the skull, special openings for emissary veins. Thing to remember is that in veins में valves नहीं होते. They are valveless. As a result, blood flows in both directions. This way be or that way be. Normal flow of blood is out of the skull, away from the skull, away from the brain, because this is the brain. Okay? So normal flow of blood is away from the brain, is direction. But since there are no valves, so both ways ये travel कर सकता है. A few multiple phenomena होते हैं for emissary veins, but few important ones, constant ones, and important ones are. उसको mention कर लेते हैं. एक है frontal emissary vein. Passes through foramen cecum in the skull. Foramen cecum in the skull है where cranial cavity में you have ethmoid bone. Ethmoid bone and frontal bone के junction पे ये foramen होता है. Let me go back. ये ethmoid bone है, crista कहलाए ethmoid bone. इसके और frontal bone के junction पे एक foramen है. Over here. That is the foramen cecum. Okay. Now this foramen cecum connects the superior sagittal sinus, this sinus, to the frontal sinus, frontal air sinus, okay, plus the nasal cavity. In those veins of the nasal cavity and the frontal sinus, veins in the frontal sinus. Then you have a parietal emissary vein. Yeah, parietal bone vein. You have an opening in the parietal bone. यहाँ पे ये इधर parietal emissary vein होगी. These veins are bilateral. These emissary veins are one on either side through the parietal bone. ये parietal foramen जो है ना, ये superior sagittal sinus को connect करता है with veins outside the skull के जो scalp की veins होती हैं इनके साथ. So the parietal emissary foramen. This is the parietal emissary foramen that connects the superior sagittal sinus to the veins of the skull. And then this is the mastoid emissary foramen. ये mastoid process है. इसके करीब this is the mastoid emissary foramen. Mastoid emissary foramen. Now, if you have an orientation, mastoid process, deep to this area. In this area, ये देख लीजिए. This, I'm sorry. This is the superior sagittal sinus. ठीक है? ये जो है, this is a sigmoid sinus. So इस vicinity में sigmoid sinus है. So the mastoid emissary vein connects the sigmoid sinus to the mastoid, to the veins outside. अब veins outside यहाँ पे कौन सी है? Posterior auricular होएगी and occipital vein. So this emissary vein, mastoid emissary vein connects the sigmoid sinus. This is the sigmoid sinus to the posterior auricular यहाँ पे. And this is the finally, this is the condylar emissary vein. ये अभी इस पे आते हैं. Posterior condylar emissary vein. ये देखो बेटा, ये posterior auricular vein है इधर. यहाँ पे occipital vein है. ये सब occipital plexus of veins है. ठीक है? So posterior condylar emissary veins pass through the condylar canal. ये देख लीजिए, ये इन्होंने posterior condylar emissary vein बनाई है. ये ठीक है? They pass through the condylar canal. They connect. अब इस area में एक sigmoid sinus है. So they connect the sigmoid sinus to this plexus. ये जो plexus of veins है, सब occipital plexus of veins कहते हैं इसको. यहाँ पे sigmoid sinus होगा. So this posterior condylar emissary vein connects the, यहाँ पे देख लीजिए, ये था posterior condylar emissary veins. Posterior condylar emissary veins. अच्छा जी, this is as far as the veins was audiovenous sinuses and the veins were concerned. Now let's come to the blood supply of the dura. Blood supply जो है ना, vasculature of the dura जो है, they supply more of calvaria than they supply the dura. The most important is the middle meningeal artery. Middle meningeal आपको पता है is a branch of the first part of the maxillary artery. Enters the skull through this foramen, which is the foramen spinosum, the small one. Plus accessory meningeal भी कुछ supply करती है. Accessory meningeal passes through the foramen vein along with the mandibular nerve. अब ये I hope you appreciate कि ये जो sphenoid, ये जो foramen spinosum है, it is lying in the greater wing of sphenoid. ये foramen spinosum है, and this is the greater wing of sphenoid. ये इनका suture है, greater wing of sphenoid. Now this middle meningeal artery divides into two branches, with namely the frontal and the parietal branches. ये देख लीजिए, this is the middle meningeal artery. ये middle meningeal, sorry, ये maxillary और उससे ये middle meningeal arise कर रही है, ठीक है. This middle meningeal is dividing into two. This is the frontal branch and this is the parietal branch. ये जो frontal branch है ना, this crosses the terion. ये देख लीजिए, ये मार्क किया हुआ है सर्कल. ये देख लीजिए, यूनियन ऑफ फोर बोन्स, टीरियन, ठीक है. ये टीरियन पे it crosses the terion. That is why fracture of the terion में the blood vessel that is injured is the anterior branch or the frontal branch of the middle meningeal artery. So, and then this frontal branch ascends and supplies as far as the vertex. ठीक है, superiorly जाके it goes as far as the vertex. Then comes the parietal branch or the posterior branch. ये posterior-superiorly supplies the posterior aspect of the skull. ये देख लीजिए, ये parietal branch है and it is going posterior-superiorly and supplying to the posterior aspect of the skull. यहाँ पे मैंने आपको ये इसलिए दिखाई है कि इसमें देख लीजिए मिडल मेनिंजियल आर्टरी की मार्किंग्स कितनी अच्छी है. फोरामन स्पाइनोसम में से मर्ज कर रही है ये मिडल मेनिंजियल artery and it is dividing into two, the frontal branch and this is the parietal branch or the posterior branch. Clearly nazar aa rahi hai. And this is where the middle meningeal artery frontal branch is crossing the terion. Approximately this is the site where you have the terion. Now besides the middle meningeal artery you also have branches, meningeal branches from the ophthalmic artery, from the occipital artery, and from the vertebral artery. They all contribute to the blood supply of the dura mater. Venous drainage is through the middle meningeal vein, जो कि it accompanies the middle meningeal artery through the foramen spinosum, and then it drains into the pterygoid venous plexus. So the middle meningeal veins drain into the pterygoid venous plexus. Nerve supply of the dura. अब आपको पता है कि the cranial cavity we divide it into the tentorium. Tentorium divides the skull into a part above the tentorium and a part below the tentorium. Below the tentorium, lying in the posterior cranial fossa, is the cerebellum. ये हम पहले भी बहुत दफा डिस्कस कर चुके हैं. मैं आपको फिर भी दिखा देती हूँ बेटा. देखो, this is the tentorium. You have a part below the tentorium. ये posterior cranial fossa है जिसमें cerebellum है, and this is the part above the tentorium. ठीक है, one by one हम इसको ये posterior cranial fossa है, इसमें cerebellum पड़ा हुआ है, and this is the attachment of the tentorium along the red line. अच्छा जी, नर्व सप्लाई ऑफ द ड्यूरा की बात कर रहे थे. सो अब हम नर्व सप्लाई भी एक सुप्राटेंटोरियल पार्ट में होगी और इंफ्राटेंटोरियल पार्ट में होगी. Supratentorial part of the dura, that is part of the dura above the tentorium. उसमें एक तो ये falx होगा attached to the inside of the calvaria, और फिर इस ये falx तो बेटा एक midline structure है ना. Then you also have dura lining the rest of the calvaria. ये टेंटोरियम है और ये टेंटोरियल नॉच है, ठीक है। सो the ophthalmic branches, cranial nerve 5 जो है, which is trigeminal की first branch, ophthalmic branch. The ophthalmic branches supply this box. It supplies all the dura of the calvaria, lying the inside of the skull, plus the tentorium की upper surface. The tentorium है, इसकी upper surface. All this is supplied by the ophthalmic branch, first branch of the trigeminal nerve. Infratentorial part में आ जाए, अब cranial fossas की बात करते हैं। आपको पता है, you have an anterior cranial fossa, you have a middle cranial fossa, you have a posterior cranial fossa. Anterior cranial fossa, इनको you have anterior and posterior ethmoidal, ये ग्रीन में जो आपको नजर आ रहा है, this part, ये जो anterior and posterior ethmoidal nerves है ना, they are branches of ophthalmic. Ophthalmic nerve की branches हैं anterior and posterior ethmoidal. ठीक है, ophthalmic is the first branch of trigeminal. उसके अलावा you also have part of the anterior cranial fossa, the posterior part of the anterior cranial fossa. ये blue में देख लीजिए. This part is supplied by the maxillary, second branch of the trigeminal. और फिर आपकी किताब मेंशन करती है, बाकी बुक्स मेंशन नहीं करती, कि the lateral part of the anterior cranial fossa, ये जो पिंक में नजर आ रहा है, this is supplied by the mandibular. So मैंने आगे क्वेश्चन मार्क डाल दिया कि what to remember, it's all right. So anterior cranial fossa is supplied in the midline by the ethmoidal branches of the ophthalmic. ये देख लीजिए, इसी को देख लीजिए, ethmoidal branches of the ophthalmic. Then the posterior part of the anterior cranial fossa is supplied by the maxillary, and the lateral part of the anterior cranial fossa is supplied by the, over here, this is the mandibular. Middle cranial fossa पे आ जाए, relatively easy है. The anterior part of the middle cranial fossa is supplied by maxillary, and the posterior part of the middle cranial fossa is supplied by the mandibular. Mandibular is the third branch of trigeminal, और maxillary तो आपको पता ही है, second branch of trigeminal. ये CNV2 is cranial nerve 5 की second branch. ठीक है, posterior cranial fossa पे आ जाए. अब posterior cranial fossa का जो ड्यूरा है, floor of the posterior cranial fossa की हम बात कर रहे हैं. This dura is not supplied by अभी तक trigeminal की branches से supply नहीं होता. So floor of the posterior cranial fossa is not supplied by branches of trigeminal. In fact, ये spinal branches जो हैं C2 and C3 की, ये सप्लाई करती हैं. अब ये स्पाइनल ब्रांचेस कैसे आती हैं? These spinal branches of C2 and C3, they travel with the 10th cranial nerve, that is the vagus nerve, and also the 12th cranial nerve, which is the hypoglossal. So arachnoid and pia, arachnoid plus pia together are called leptomeninges. So this is the leptomeninges. Developmentally, they are arise as a have a common development. Okay? That is why they do not separate out completely. इनके दरमियान ये connections, ये purple में arachnoid है और ये brown में, yellow में pia है. So the connections between these two, because they have a common origin, the connection between the arachnoid and pia, this is seen as arachnoid trabeculae. This is simply processes of fibroblasts. ठीक है? अब subarachnoid के space जो है between the pia and the arachnoid, you have the subarachnoid space, and it is because of the pressure of the subarachnoid space that pushes the arachnoid matter against the dura matter. ये पाया सॉरी ये पाया है बेटा, this brown, and whatever it this pia simply is adherent to the brain. It is not separable from the brain. It dips into every depression, every fissure, everything in the brain. जहां जहां जो भी आएगा, arachnoid देख लीजिए ऊपर से गुजर गया, dura ऊपर से गुजर गया, लेकिन pia is following every contour of the brain. That is, it gives the brain a shiny appearance. ठीक है? Whatever blood vessels penetrate into the brain, they carry a sleeve of pia with it. ये yellow देख लीजिए blood vessel के साथ. So between the pia and the blood vessel, this is a very arterial space. One last thing, extremely important thing, and that is the meningeal spaces. You have an extradural space, the space between the dura and the skull. This is the extradural space. ये natural space नहीं है. However, in cases of fracture of the skull, blood vessel accumulates in this extradural space. ठीक है? Spinal extradural space भी है, but spinal cord में surround करता है, आपको पता है वहाँ पे periosteal dura नहीं होता, वहाँ सिर्फ meningeal dura होता है. So extradural space is between the periosteum of the vertebrae and the meningeal layer of dura. Normally this space exists करती है and it is full of fat. Subdural space अभी पहले बताया था, that was epidural space या cranial extradural space. Subdural space is between the dura and the arachnoid. ये dura है बेटा, and the arachnoid, इसको cover कर रहा है arachnoid. This is the subdural space. And then of course this is a subarachnoid space between the arachnoid and the pia. You have the arachnoid subarachnoid space जिसमें CSF होता है, जिस पर blood होती है, and of course you have trabecular cells. आपकी सब blood vessels इसी में ही होती हैं. So that is where we end. एक last slide ये है where blood accumulates. ये subdural space पे, ये epidural space है. Fracture of the skull में between the dura and the skull, epidural space है. Between the two layers of dura, between the dura and the arachnoid, you have subdural space में blood है, hematoma, subdural hematoma, और ये subarachnoid space. Thank you very much. See you next time, inshallah, with something else. I don't suppose you have any questions. Normally, आप लोगों का ask me question होता भी नहीं है. आप लोग माशाल्लाह very intelligent people you are.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम मैम. मैम लेक्चर का टाइम ओवर हो गया.
जी बेटे मैंने खत्म कर लिया है.
ओके मैम.